forgotten some of the history we've lived from colonialism through the conversation of the right to development to where we are now, and have moved to very micro responses to what are really macro issues. And I think that we need to continue micro efforts, but look at the macro picture as well. My organization, the United Methodist Church, says in order to provide for basic needs, ways must be found to share more equitably the resources of the world. So my point of departure is the fact that the essence of the problem has to do with inequality of the distribution of wealth and resources, both between nations as well as within nations, and that we need to go to that place. The current global system reflects the expectation that many people will live in poverty, that's built into the system. It's not a mistake. It's not an error. It's intrinsic to the system. Or have the nations torn by conflict so that others will live in abundance. That many people will move as a result of that is a fact of life. Migrants and refugees are battered by the divide between rich and poor, which is rooted in colonialism and corporate globalization. And currently, more than 10% of the world's population consumes 85% of the world's wealth. So we're trying to, we need to look at that kind of global picture. Let's remember the legacy of colonialism. We start with huge gaps in rich and poor between nations. There was conversation in the 70s about a new international economic order. The Western developed nations have promised and keep promising and keep repeating that they'll give development aid of 0.7%, except for very few Scandinavian countries. It's never happened. So those are promises of transferring wealth back that isn't happening. And of course, we have the goal 8 of the Millennium Development Goals, which was the only commitment that the northern countries had to make, which was about a partnership for development of sharing resources to enable development to happen around some very minimalist goals, not right to development anymore, but eradicating a tiny percent of poverty. And yet those goals are not really on the agenda and are not being met either. What do we get in the 80s? We get instead the Washington Consensus, a neoliberal agenda that in many countries was imposed through the debt crisis, through the IFIs, structural adjustment, later PRSPs. So we can't talk about development without remembering this history, that this is what has left countries incredibly impoverished. I'm not going to go through every list, but I think all of you who've lived through it know. Deregulation, cuts in public spending, focus on export industries that in many cases have been managed by transnational corporations who repatriate profits. The massive rise in interest rates for indebted countries. Trade liberalization that asked poor nations to open borders but and dumped subsidies, which Professor Adepoju mentioned. Debt repayments, profit repatriation, capital flight, etc. So this is a major point that I want to make. I think this is one of the 3 major points. 1, distribution of wealth. 2, the global south is in fact subsidizing the global north. It's not that we need this little bit of development aid, this little bit of assistance for a micro-enterprise partnership. The fact is that we have massive flows of capital outward through these different processes, and that in fact there's a net outflow of resources from the global south to the global north. A new study that just came out in May that many of you may have seen, that was for UNDP, said that the 48 countries classified as least developed countries lost a total of $246 billion in illicit financial flows from 1990 to 2008. Unless we think that all of that has to do with corrupt nations in the global south. In fact, trade mispricing, particularly by transnational corporations, accounts for about 65 to 70% of those illicit capital flows. So one commentator in Africa said that would have more than covered the debt, the remaining debt of the least developed countries, that amount of money that's flowing outward. We were asked for some case studies. I don't want to go into detail because I don't have time, but I would note that in this case, this is a debt-related case. that PRSPs that have in many cases been imposed on countries created, in this case around liberalization of groundnut, created new forms of poverty that precipitated huge contraction of economic growth in Senegal. Pushing another point that my sister from PSI mentioned is that the privatization of hospitals, the privatization of the public sector has eliminated jobs, particularly for women, as she was saying. And so these are things that didn't happen out of the blue. They happened through PRSPs and structural adjustment policies. And the other, which Oscar referred to this morning, and so we don't need to say much, but I'm from U.S., and we know that NAFTA meant that the U.S. was able to dump cheap corn on Mexico and literally eliminated millions of jobs in the countryside of Mexico, and that those people have now ended up in the United States. About 60% of undocumented workers in the U.S. are now from Mexico, from a direct result of a trade liberalization policy. Millennium Development Goals, which is now the new development paradigm from the UN, a very minimalist paradigm, not the right to development and economic and social cultural rights for all, but a very minimalist paradigm. Nonetheless, while it's important, the onus has been put on the global south to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, ignoring the whole history that I just ran through. Now that you've been impoverished, that these resources have been sucked out of your country, that policies have been imposed upon you, now figure out how to eliminate poverty in your countries and deliver accountabilities. So there's a contradiction. Time? Okay. A contradiction between the concepts of poverty eradication in the MDGs and the macroeconomic and trade and financial policies of the Washington Consensus. So, as I mentioned, the South is subsidizing the North. What happens with migration, and this is my last and third point, people migrate due to this poverty. The huge increases in the last 30 years have to do with these neoliberal policies. Then they begin to send money home as a strategy for survival, for their families. And then we begin to hear of those survival strategies as a new development policy. So my argument is that this is fundamentally wrong. And I want to be really, really respectful of people who are working in remittances, in microenterprise, understanding that what people do as a survival strategy is something that we need to respect and honor, that those are important survival strategies. But that is not the same as saying that that is a development strategy. That is something that people are doing out of necessity, but that the real development strategies have to do with changing those kinds of policies that have created the poverty to begin with. So there are other reasons, climate change, etc., that are causing more outflows of resources. And let's see. I'll get to these later. I'll finish there. But I think that what we need to do is to focus on the obligation that governments have to protect economic and social rights, and that as NGOs, while it's important, or civil society, for us to support those kinds of survival strategies that we've been discussing so far today, we actually need to be holding the government's feet to the fire for their obligation to protect in terms of delivering economic and social and cultural rights. And that's going to mean challenging the Washington Consensus and the trade and finance policies that have, in fact, impoverished countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carol, for also sticking to the time. I think you have heard a lot now. So I would suggest that we first break for a coffee so that you can digest it all.